the good, the bad, and the ugly. We must confront them all, for they are the chapters of our shared story.
About this person, Robert Bouchon, who has posted this status, and he collaborates, if you will, often with MJ Constidious Johnson, this nonprofit group Best 13, and
we got interrupted by a dog. So something about this one case caught my eye, and I went digging. And I looked at police reports and read those, and I was just kind of, the case is kind of interesting. For gift cards or different things if you vote early. And I have something to say about that. And I think it should appall everybody that churches are doing this, or that anybody's doing it, because to me it's like buying votes, because their taglines are "Let's make history" and things like that. And y'all know what they're talking about.
One of the things that I think helped us most was after the primary, we jumped on the Zoom call, about 20 or so people. MJ jumped on, Robert, Shalette, several people that was just concerned about our turnout.
Sure.
Robert Bouchon was going to be on the show.
That's right.
And he told me, he said, Alvin, he said, let me tell you what I want you to do. I said, what's that? He said, I want you to thank Robert Bouchon. And I want you to thank Marcus Johnson of Best 13. He said that day you put Robert on the
report.
You know, it was Robert, Marcus, Quentin Alt.
Oh, yeah.
There was so many of those young men and ladies that we're so proud of. And we couldn't have done it without their help.
Sweet Pack mine. My boy always eating. Hey, playing okay.
Legal disclaimer. This documentary is an independent educational and analytical work created for informational and commentary purposes. It is protected under fair use provisions of U.S. copyright law for purposes of criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. All archival materials, photographs, and historical references are used for educational and transformative purposes. This work does not claim ownership of any copyrighted materials and makes no commercial claims to the likeness, image, or legacy of Jesse Jackson or any other individuals mentioned. The views and analysis presented represent independent historical and political commentary and do not constitute official biography, endorsement, or authorization by Jesse Jackson, his family, or any affiliated organizations. All factual claims are based on publicly available historical records, documented events, and scholarly analysis. Any errors are unintentional. This is a work of critical documentary analysis, not official representation, between the dream and the deal. The price of rising. There is something this country has always feared. Not black suffering, not black poverty, not even black anger. What it has feared, consistently, strategically, methodically, is organized black ambition. Ambition that scales, ambition that mobilizes, ambition that threatens to reorganize power. America has tolerated protest. It has tolerated symbolic inclusion. But it has never comfortably tolerated independent black political infrastructure. And that tension between ambition and containment is where Jesse Jackson's story lives. Not in mythology, not in nostalgia, but in that tension. He was born in 1941 in Greenville, South Carolina, a place where hierarchy was not hidden. Segregation was not coded, it was explicit. White signs, black entrances, unwritten rules enforced with violence. He was born out of wedlock to a teenage mother. Now understand something. In Jim Crow America, being born black was already political. Being born poor was already limiting. Being born illegitimate in a church-centered Southern culture carried social weight that followed you. That kind of beginning shapes ego. It shapes drive. It shapes the hunger to be seen and the determination never to be dismissed. And here's where we begin reading him not as symbol, but as man. Because overachievement often grows in soil of stigma. When you start at the margins, you either internalize limitation or you fight it relentlessly. Jesse Jackson fought it. Athletics, academics, presence. He understood early that charisma is currency. And in black America, the pulpit is one of the first places where charisma becomes power. The black church is not merely theological, it is political. It is communal infrastructure. It is emotional refuge. It is economic network. It has always been a staging ground for strategy. And Jackson learned to master it. Not just preach, but move people. That skill would become his weapon. But weapons change depending on the battlefield. Chicago, where idealism met structure. When he moved north, he encountered a different form of oppression. The South humiliated you openly. The North smiled and denied you loans. The South segregated buses. The North segregated neighborhoods through policy. The South used sheriffs. The North used zoning boards. Chicago taught him something critical. Power hides behind systems. And if you want to disrupt systems, you must understand how they operate. That's where he encountered Martin Luther King Jr. And let's pause here, because history often flattens relationships. Jackson was not King's equal. He was not King's replacement. He was not King's shadow either. He was a young, ambitious organizer stepping into a movement that was already historic. King's expansion into Chicago was strategic. The South had visible brutality. But the North had structural inequality, which was harder to televise, harder to dramatize, harder to shame. Operation Breadbasket was not romantic protest. It was leverage. If corporations would not hire black workers, they would lose black dollars. And this is where, through a progressive lens, we can both respect and interrogate. Because economic pressure is not revolutionary in theory, but it is disruptive in practice. Jackson thrived there. He wasn't just marching. He was negotiating. He wasn't just preaching. He was pressuring. And here is where the story deepens. Because while young black organizers were learning to apply pressure, the federal government was learning to apply counter pressure. COINTELPRO, the state strikes back. We cannot tell this story without widening the frame. In 1956, the FBI launched the counterintelligence program. Its goal was not merely to monitor. It was to neutralize, to prevent the consolidation of black political unity, to disrupt movements before they matured, to create distrust within organizations. to weaponize rumor, surveillance, infiltration. The language in the memos is not subtle. Prevent the rise of a black messiah. The fear was not violence. The fear was consolidation. Malcolm X was surveilled relentlessly. His organization infiltrated, internal divisions amplified. Fred Hampton, young, brilliant, coalition building in Chicago, was infiltrated by an informant, raided, killed. The Black Panthers were disrupted through informants, false letters, legal pressure, media framing. King himself was wiretapped, harassed, threatened. Now here's the layered question. Why did Jesse Jackson survive an era that eliminated other leaders? We must ask that without conspiracy, without fantasy, but without naivety. Was he less radical? Yes. Was he less threatening in armed terms? Yes. But was he politically threatening? Absolutely. He was organizing economic disruption. He was mobilizing black consumers, black voters. He was building networks. So why survive? Possibilities. Because his strategy was integrationist rather than separatist. Because he worked inside electoral politics. Because his approach aligned more closely with liberal institutionalism than revolutionary nationalism. Or because he was adaptable enough to avoid direct collision. There is no memo that says let him live. History is not that clean, but there is a pattern. The state responds differently to armed radicalism than to institutional negotiation. That doesn't make institutional negotiation safe. It makes it differently risky. When you negotiate inside a system that historically oppressed your people, you must constantly ask, are you extracting power or are you being absorbed by it? That question will follow Jackson his entire life. After King and visibility. When King was assassinated, the movement fractured. Grief creates openings. Openings invite ambition. Jackson stepped forward, publicly visible, emotionally charged. He claimed he was present for King's final words. Some dispute that detail. But what matters is this. After King, America needed a visible black voice. And Jackson positioned himself to be one. Positioning is not inherently sinister. It is political reality. Movements without succession plans fracture. Movements without structure fade. Jackson understood something many activists struggle with. Visibility sustains momentum, but visibility also attracts scrutiny. And once you become a national black leader, you are no longer just an activist. You are a variable in American political calculus. You are monitored, analyzed, measured, and the tension grows. Because the more influence you build, the more careful you must be. One misstep becomes national. One remark becomes amplified. One error becomes narrative. And yet he kept building. Building push, infrastructure, not just inspiration. In 1971, he founded PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. Notice the language. Not overthrow, not revolution, not resistance. Save. Humanity. That framing matters. It softens the edge. It broadens appeal. It signals inclusion. Through PUSH, Jackson institutionalized his approach. Corporate negotiations, employment demands, political endorsements, voter registration. He turned protest into infrastructure. Now here's the progressive tension again. Infrastructure is powerful, but infrastructure inside capitalism does not dismantle capitalism. It negotiates within it. For poor black families in Chicago, jobs mattered. For activists dreaming of structural overhaul, inclusion was insufficient. Jackson walked that line, and walking that line is exhausting. Too radical, you are neutralized. Too moderate, you are mistrusted. Too silent, you are irrelevant. Too loud, you're targeted. He chose relevance. And relevance inside America requires coalition. The Rainbow Coalition emerged from that logic. Black voters, Latino voters, poor white farmers, labor unions. a coalition of the economically marginalized. From a progressive lens, this was powerful because it reframed politics around class and exclusion, not just race. But coalition politics demands compromise, and compromise creates critics, especially in communities that have been compromised historically. By the late 1970s, Jackson was no longer simply a civil rights preacher. He was a national political actor, and the leap to presidential campaigns was not ego alone. It was strategic escalation. The leap when protest becomes presidential, 1984. By the early 1980s, America was shifting. Ronald Reagan was in office. The language of government had turned toward austerity, deregulation, and a hard-edged conservatism. The war on drugs was expanding. Urban disinvestment was accelerating. Public housing was deteriorating. Mass incarceration was quietly building its foundation. Black communities were being squeezed from multiple angles: economic neglect, policing expansion, shrinking federal support. And in that environment, Jesse Jackson announced he was running for president in 1984. This was not symbolic. It was disruptive. Understand how radical that decision was at the time. A black man from segregated South Carolina, born in 1941, running for the presidency just 20 years after the Civil Rights Act. This was not just a campaign. It was a confrontation with political imagination. Because until someone runs, the possibility does not exist. And here is where, through a progressive lens, we must give him full credit. He did not wait for permission. He did not wait for establishment comfort. He forced the issue. But running inside the Democratic Party was not a neutral decision. It was strategic and controversial. Some activists believe true black political power required independent organization, a separate political vehicle, independent institutions, autonomous agenda setting. Jackson chose to compete inside the party structure. Why? Because the American electoral system punishes outsiders structurally. Ballot access laws, media gatekeeping, fundraising barriers. An independent black presidential campaign in the 1980s would likely have been symbolically powerful and electorally isolated. So he made a calculation. Better to shift the Democratic Party's center of gravity than to shout from the margins. That calculation would define his career. The Rainbow Coalition, class, race, and possibility. Jackson's campaign language was not purely racial. It was economic. He spoke of farmers losing land, workers losing jobs, students burdened by debt, communities abandoned by industry. He reframed the political struggle as a coalition of the excluded. Black, brown, poor, white, labor, immigrant. From a progressive standpoint, this was powerful because it rejected narrow identity politics and aimed at structural inequality. But here's where the nuance deepens. Coalitions built on shared economic pain are strong rhetorically, but fragile electorally. America's racial divisions are not easily dissolved by class messaging. And some white working class voters remained resistant to multiracial coalition building. Still, Jackson won over 3 million votes in 1984. 3 million. That number changed future strategy inside the Democratic Party, because once you demonstrate electoral viability, you cannot be ignored. But the campaign was not without damage. The Hymietown remark, a moment of indiscipline, a slur, a leak, and suddenly media coverage narrowed. This is where we must be honest. Language matters. Coalitions require precision. You cannot build multiracial solidarity while alienating other marginalized communities. Jackson apologized, but politics is not therapy, it is consequence. The remark capped the campaign's ceiling. Still, 3 million votes. Not a protest candidacy, not a novelty. A real campaign. 1988, closer to the center of power. 4 years later, he ran again. The 1988 campaign was more disciplined, more organized, more polished. He won nearly 7 million votes, 13 primaries. He came in second. Second For a black candidate in 1988, that was tectonic. Future candidates, including Barack Obama, would walk through structural openings Jackson helped create. But here's where progressive critique becomes sharper. Winning votes is not the same as reshaping policy. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Democratic Party itself was shifting. Neoliberalism was rising. Market-oriented reforms, tough-on-crime rhetoric, welfare reform conversations. The party moved toward the center, toward corporate-friendly positioning. So the question becomes, did Jackson shift the party left, or did the party absorb his energy while continuing its rightward drift? There is no easy answer, because political institutions are not monolithic. They contain factions. Jackson expanded the influence of black voters inside the party, but expansion of influence does not equal control. And here's the progressive tension again. Is working inside a system a long-term strategy for transformation, or does it gradually dilute radical edge? Jackson believed in incremental leverage. Push, expand, negotiate, push again. Revolutionary purists often reject that approach. But revolutionary movements in America have historically been suppressed violently. Incrementalists survive longer, and survival is political. The war on drugs policy as structural violence. While Jesse Jackson was building coalitions and running campaigns, something else was consolidating power quietly. The war on drugs, officially framed as crime control. Unofficially, it functioned as spatial containment. Beginning in the Nixon era and accelerating under Reagan, drug policy shifted from public health framing to criminal enforcement escalation. Mandatory minimum sentences, crack versus powder cocaine disparities, expanded federal policing grants, asset forfeiture incentives. These were not symbolic shifts. They were structural. Black neighborhoods were not just policed, they were saturated. Here is where progressive critique sharpens. Jackson spoke against inequity. He criticized sentencing disparities. He advocated for opportunity. But the machinery of mass incarceration expanded anyway. The prison population exploded from roughly 500,000 in 1980 to over 2 million by the early 2000s. That is not incidental, that is design. And when design reshapes entire communities, the question is not whether one leader opposed it rhetorically. The question is whether structural leverage was sufficient. Could Jackson, with his national platform, have mobilized broader resistance to punitive expansion? Or were institutional incentives too powerful? Here is the uncomfortable truth. Political capital is finite. If you push too aggressively on crime policy in the 1980s and 1990s, you risk being labeled soft on crime. And in that era, soft on crime was politically fatal. Democrats, attempting to reclaim national viability after Reagan landslides, hardened their stance. They embraced punitive frameworks to appear tough. Jackson criticized aspects of this shift, but he did not fracture the coalition over it. Should he have? Was coalition preservation worth policy compromise? That question remains open, because political isolation rarely produces policy reversal, but coalition without leverage produces stagnation. And this tension defines institutional politics. Neoliberalism, the quiet transformation. While culture wars dominated headlines, economic ideology shifted more quietly. Deregulation, free trade expansion, corporate consolidation, welfare retrenchment. Neoliberalism reframed government's role from provider to facilitator of markets, and poor communities felt the shift first. Public housing deteriorated, union strength declined, manufacturing jobs left urban cores. The Rainbow Coalition sought to unite economically marginalized groups. And here is where historical humility becomes necessary. No civil rights leader controls global capital flows. No coalition alone reverses macroeconomic transformation. But leaders do shape resistance frameworks. Jackson's approach was incremental inclusion, push corporations to hire, push institutions to open access, push party leadership to expand representation. He did not call for systemic overhaul of capitalism. He sought distributive justice within it. That was a strategic choice, and strategic choices define legacy. Access, the double-edged sword. After the campaigns, Jackson became something rare, a permanent national political figure without elected office. He could call senators, meet governors, engage presidents. Access opens doors, but access also creates perception. Was he influencing power or becoming comfortable around it? Corporate relationships expanded, fundraising became necessary, nonprofit structures grew complex. Financial scrutiny emerged, transparency questions surfaced. No criminal convictions, but public trust fluctuated. And here's the reality. Black leaders are scrutinized more harshly. White politicians survive scandals routinely. Black leaders often endure amplified moral judgment. But that does not remove responsibility. Moral authority must be guarded carefully when it is central to your platform. Jackson's personal scandal in 2001, fathering a child outside his marriage, undermined his pulpit-based credibility. It did not erase his accomplishments, but it complicated his moral narrative. Movements built around righteousness feel hypocrisy deeply, and yet he remained relevant, which speaks to the depth of infrastructure he built. Because infrastructure outlives scandal. The progressive lens, respect and critique. From a young black progressive lens, one rooted in the trenches, aware of systemic oppression, protective of the poor, skeptical of state power, Jesse Jackson's life presents dual truths. Truth one, he expanded political imagination. He mobilized voters. He forced the Democratic Party to confront black electoral strength. He built durable institutions. Truth two, he operated inside a system that continued to harm black communities. He did not dismantle neoliberal drift. He navigated power without fully transforming its structure. Both can be true. Progressivism requires honesty. It requires refusing hero worship and refusing lazy dismissal. It asks, did he move the needle? Yes. Did he move it far enough? Debatable. Did he survive in an era when survival itself was rare? Yes. Was survival the goal or transformation? That question lingers. Diplomacy without a title, soft power in a hard world. By the 1990s, Jesse Jackson was no longer trying to prove viability. He had already done that. He had built institutions, he had mobilized voters, he had reshaped electoral math. Now he occupied a different space, moral diplomat. He traveled to Syria to negotiate the release of American hostages. He met with Fidel Castro in Cuba. He engaged with foreign governments in moments where official U.S. channels were frozen or tense. This was unusual. He held no elected office, no cabinet appointment, no formal diplomatic authority. And yet doors opened. That says something. Soft power operates differently than legislation. It relies on credibility, visibility, perceived moral authority. Jackson's civil rights history gave him entry where others might have been rejected. Supporters argued he was extending American influence in humanitarian ways. Critics questioned whether freelance diplomacy blurred lines between activism and statecraft. But the hostages came home, and when people return home alive, abstract debates soften. Still, from a progressive lens, we must ask deeper questions. When a civil rights leader meets with foreign heads of state, is he acting independently, or does he inevitably reinforce U.S. geopolitical narratives? There is no clean answer, because diplomacy is layered, and soft power can both disrupt and reinforce empire. Jackson believed engagement was better than isolation. That belief aligned with his broader philosophy: push, negotiate, insert yourself into the room, even if the room was built by those who historically excluded you. The Clinton era, proximity and constraint. The 1990s introduced a new Democratic administration. Bill Clinton, A president who spoke fluently about opportunity, but whose policies included welfare reform, crime legislation, and centrist triangulation. Jackson maintained access during this era. But this is where progressive critique intensifies. The 1994 crime bill expanded incarceration. Welfare reform reshaped the social safety net. Neoliberal economics accelerated. And black communities continued experiencing structural harm. Jackson criticized inequities, but he remained within Democratic coalitions. Could more pressure have been applied? Could leverage have been used differently? Or was he operating within structural constraints that limited radical departure? Political power inside institutions is rarely absolute. Even presidents are constrained by Congress, courts, capital, media. A civil rights leader without formal office operates with even narrower margins. But narrow margins still allow moral positioning. And this is where his legacy becomes complex. He pushed, but he did not break. He pressured, but he did not sever. He criticized, but he did not abandon. To some, that was maturity. To others, that was accommodation. Both readings persist. Scumanity interrupts iconography. In 2001, news broke that Jesse Jackson had fathered a child outside his marriage. For any public figure, this is disruptive. For a preacher, it is devastating. Movements built on moral rhetoric experience scandal as rupture. His image had long been associated with discipline, responsibility, black family stability. The revelation introduced contradiction. He apologized, privately reconciled, publicly endured. But here is a truth about leadership. Public morality is rarely spotless, and leaders who build movements on ethical language must navigate higher expectations. Some supporters forgave, some distanced, but the institution remained. That speaks to the depth of the infrastructure he built, because infrastructure outlives scandal. Obama's succession and silent displacement. In 2008, Barack Obama ran for president. And suddenly, the question that had hovered for decades materialized. Could a black man actually win? Obama represented a different archetype. Polished, measured, Harvard-educated, technocratic. He did not emerge from the pulpit tradition. He emerged from constitutional law and legislative strategy. He did not frame himself as civil rights clergy. He framed himself as national statesman. Jackson initially supported him, but during the campaign, Obama gave speeches addressing absent black fathers. Jackson was caught on a hot mic expressing anger, saying he wanted to cut Obama's manhood. The comment exploded in media cycles. An analysis rushed in. Was it jealousy? Was it generational tension? Was it protectiveness? Here is a deeper reading. Jackson represented the civil rights generation, street marches, church networks, economic boycotts. Obama represented post-civil rights institutional ascension, elite education, policy fluency, coalition calibration. When Obama won, cameras captured Jackson in tears. Tears are layered. Pride, relief, recognition, and possibly irrelevance. Because once the door you forced open is walked through by someone else, your role changes. You are no longer the possibility. You are the precedent. Precedents are respected, but they are not centered. And that shift can be psychologically heavy. From a progressive lens, Obama's presidency itself was complex. Historic, symbolic, transformative in image, but constrained by capital, congressional obstruction, global financial crisis, and institutional inertia. Jackson had paved the way for viability. Obama proved electability. Neither dismantled structural inequality. And that's the hard truth. Symbolism shifts culture, policy shifts structure. The two do not always align perfectly. Parkinson's, the body slows, the questions remain. In 2017, Jesse Jackson announced he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. The public saw the tremor, the slower cadence, the visible aging. Time is undefeated. The body eventually claims what ambition once commanded. But here's what matters. he remained present. Not as forceful, not as dominant, but present. Movements age, leaders age, institutions evolve or stagnate, and legacy is not frozen in prime. It is assessed over decades. Long shadows. Officially, COINTELPRO ended in 1971. Unofficially, surveillance culture evolved. The state learned. Overt infiltration became subtler. Monitoring became digitized. Containment became bureaucratized. The question for our analysis is not whether Jesse Jackson was allowed to rise. That framing oversimplifies complex dynamics. The deeper question is how the state recalibrates its response depending on the perceived threat level. When leaders advocate armed resistance, the response historically has been swift and violent. When leaders advocate institutional participation, the response often shifts toward negotiation, monitoring, and selective partnership. This does not imply control, it implies strategic tolerance. Jackson operated in that tolerated space, pressuring institutions without declaring them illegitimate. Malcolm X challenged American moral hypocrisy internationally. Fred Hampton built multiracial radical coalitions. Both were seen as destabilizing. Jackson pushed for inclusion within American democracy. That difference mattered. It does not erase surveillance, it reframes the risk calculus. And progressive critique must avoid fantasy. Not every surviving leader was compromised. Not every eliminated leader was pure. Structures respond to strategy, and strategy shapes survival. The Democratic Party, absorption or transformation. One of the most consequential questions in evaluating Jesse Jackson is this: did he transform the Democratic Party, or did the Democratic Party absorb him? After his campaigns, black voter turnout became central to Democratic strategy. Representation increased, cabinet positions diversified, rhetoric shifted. But policy outcomes remained constrained. Crime policy hardened, welfare reform narrowed safety nets, economic inequality widened. Institutional politics is rarely revolutionary. It is iterative, and iteration feels slow in communities experiencing crisis. But the alternative, complete withdrawal, rarely yields representation. Jackson's bet was that participation would gradually shift center of gravity. And it did, demographically. Whether it shifted policy sufficiently is still debated. Generational progression from pulpit to policy tech. The civil rights generation built power through moral clarity and visible sacrifice. Marches, arrests, boycotts. The post-civil rights generation built power through credentialing and institutional fluency. Law degrees, policy frameworks, legislative strategy. Jackson straddled the two. He emerged from the pulpit tradition but entered institutional politics. Obama emerged from institutional politics with rhetorical echoes of movement language. The difference is instructive. Jackson mobilized through moral urgency. Obama governed through technocratic calibration. Neither escaped constraint. But the style shift reflects broader transformation in black political strategy. From protest to participation, from moral confrontation to policy negotiation. And progressive critique asks, has participation replaced confrontation too thoroughly? Have institutions reshaped activism more than activism has reshaped institutions? These are not accusations. They are structural inquiries. Surveillance state, continuity into the digital era. Post 9/11 America expanded surveillance dramatically. Patriot Act, digital monitoring, data aggregation. The tools changed, the logic remained. Power monitors potential disruption. Jackson's peak years preceded digital mass surveillance, but the broader pattern of state observation remained constant. Black political organizing has rarely existed unobserved. And survival inside that context requires strategic calibration. The more national your influence, the more carefully you must navigate language, alliances, and framing. Jackson survived not because he was irrelevant, but because he operated within a pressure-aware strategy. Infrastructure via iconography. There are two types of leaders. those who leave myth and those who leave machinery. Myth inspires. Machinery persists. Jackson left machinery. Voter registration models, coalition templates, negotiation frameworks, institutional memory. Machinery can be used by others, adapted, expanded, or diluted. But it exists, and that matters. The progressive conclusion, unfinished work. For a young black progressive analyzing his life, the verdict is layered. He expanded possibility. He institutionalized pressure. He normalized national black ambition. He did not dismantle structural inequality. He did not halt carceral expansion. He did not break neoliberal dominance. He operated inside American democracy and attempted to widen it. Was that enough? History does not measure leaders by perfection. It measures them by trajectory. He shifted trajectory. He did not complete transformation. But no individual has. The work continues. Final image between dream and deal. America has always demanded something from black leaders. Be radical enough to inspire, but not radical enough to destabilize. Be present, but not threatening. Be moral, but not confrontational. Be ambitious, but not disruptive. Jackson navigated those contradictions for decades. He made deals. He carried dreams. Sometimes the deals limited the dreams. Sometimes the dreams justified the deals. And in that tension between dream and deal, his life unfolded. Not myth, not martyr, not villain. A strategist in a system resistant to change. And whether you see that as compromise or evolution depends on how you define power. Some leaders die young and become myth. Some leaders live long and become complicated. Jesse Jackson belongs to the second category. He walked the tightrope between protest and power, between moral authority and political calculation, between coalition and compromise, between dream and deal. He did not overthrow the system. He forced it to acknowledge him. He did not build an independent nation. He built infrastructure inside the existing one. He did not escape criticism. He endured it. He did not remain radical in the romantic sense. He remained present in the institutional sense. And maybe that is the most honest reading. In a country that once wrote memos about preventing the rise of a black messiah, he rose. Not as a messiah, but as a negotiator. Not as a revolutionary general, but as a political tactician. Not as myth, as man. And perhaps for a young black progressive looking at the trenches, that lesson matters most. Power is not pure. Change is not instant. Survival is not surrender. But survival alone is not liberation. The work continues. End credits disclaimer. This documentary was produced independently for educational, analytical, and transformative purposes under fair use doctrine. No authorization, endorsement, or partnership with Jesse Jackson, his family, Rainbow Push Coalition, or any affiliated persons or organizations is claimed or implied. All historical analysis, political commentary, and critical perspectives presented are the independent views of the filmmakers and do not represent official positions of any individuals or institutions mentioned. Archival materials, photographs, news footage, and historical documents are used under fair use for purposes of criticism, comment, scholarship, and education. For questions, corrections, or additional context, contact the production team. This work is dedicated to honest historical inquiry and the ongoing struggle for justice, equity, and structural transformation. Copyright 2025, all rights reserved.
Yeah, tap in.